Good morning, my name is Rakan Mia. I'm speaking with the Queensland Social Workers Association about psychiatric injury and workplace negligence and whether Queensland law fairly protects social workers whose role explodes into trauma. Members of this association work in child protection, domestic violence, and crisis response. Exposure to distressing material is not the exception in these roles. It is part of the work, and it is linked with conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and vicarious trauma. The impact is personal, but it is also organizational and public. Recovery often takes longer, costs to services are higher, time away from work increases, and teams lose capacity. National figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics show that about 21.5% of adults experience a mental disorder in a given year, and around 42.9% across a lifetime. Safe Work Australia also reports that psychological injuries tend to involve longer recovery and greater cost than many physical injuries. Queensland's own Code of Practice lists traumatic events as a recognised psychosocial hazard. If negligence law is supposed to balance the interests of workers, employers, and the community, we need to ask whether that balance is being achieved for social work. My central argument is that the current framework underprotects social workers who develop psychiatric injury through cumulative exposure over time. These injuries are real, yet the legal tests were designed with discrete incidents in mind. I will first outline the state of the law on duty, breach, causation, and defences. I will then explain where the framework fails to recognise cumulative trauma in this setting. Finally, I will propose targeted reforms that align negligence with contemporary management of psychosocial risk under the Civil Liability Act 2003. Employers owe a duty to provide a safe system of work that includes psychological safety as well as physical safety. The High Court recognises psychiatric injury as a compensable harm when it's reasonably foreseeable. That approach comes through in Tame v New South Wales and Annetts v Australian Stations, where the idea of a person of normal fortitude is a consideration rather than a barrier, and a sudden shock is not required. In employment, the duty sharpens when risk is known or should be known from the nature of the role, from incidents or from complaints and workloads. The underlying duty to provide a safe system is long-standing, as explained in Condis v State Transport Authority. The message in Kohler v Cerebos is that foreseeability in workplace stress turns on what the employer knew or ought to have known. A recent reminder is Kozarov v Victoria in the High Court, which looked closely at warning signs and the availability of practical steps like rotation and support. Because exposure to traumatic material is predictable in social work, a reasonable employer plans for the reality with clear policies, supportive supervision, and structured opportunities to debrief. Whether an employer has breached the duty depends on what a reasonable employer would have done in the circumstances. Section 9 of the Civil Liability Act asks whether the risk was foreseeable, whether it was not insignificant, and whether reasonable precautions were available. The familiar risk calculus, probability of harm, seriousness of harm, the burden of precautions, and social utility, guides that analysis, reflecting the approach in Yong Shire Council v. Shirt. In social work, sensible precautions are well understood. They include keeping caseloads within safe ranges, scheduling supervision, and structured debriefing, training about vicarious trauma, assessing psychosocial hazards in a systematic way, and finally, ensuring timely access to the Employee Assistance Program. As Kohler and Kozarov indicate, once risk is apparent, practical precautions move from optional to expected. The more an employer knows about workload pressure, critical incidents, and staff distress, the more it is reasonable to expect a considered response. Causation has two steps. First, we ask whether the injury would probably have occurred without the employer's failure. Second, we ask whether the kind of harm falls within the risk created by that failure. Psychiatric injury often reflects several influences, including work exposure, pre-existing vulnerability, and life stresses. The courts use common sense to evaluate those interactions, as explained in March v. Strama. The question is whether the workplace failure made a real difference and whether the resulting injury sits within that risk that was left unmanaged. Scope of liability is a normative judgment, and decisions such as Medellin versus v. State Government Insurance Commission and Harbour v. Walker help draw that line. There is also a clear guardrail in Tibet v. Get that recovery is not available for a bare loss of a chance. Where a breach increases risk or removes a meaningful opportunity to avoid or reduce exposure, Chappell v. Hart shows how causation can still be made out. Helpful proof includes complaints raised at the time, patterns in caseload and leave, supervision notes, referrals, and clinical opinion that links exposure with diagnosis. Section 11 of the Civil Liability Act frames this two-step inquiry. The three statutes shape this area. The Civil Liability Act of 2003 sets the test for breach in Section 9 and causation in Section 11, and includes provisions on obvious and inherent risk and peer professional opinion. The Workers' Compensation and Rehabilitation Act 2003 determines when a psychiatric condition counts as an injury, requires work to be a significant contributing factor, and excludes conditions that arise solely from reasonable management action carried out reasonably in Section 32. The Work, Health and Safety Act of 2011 imposes a primary duty in Section 19 to manage psychosocial hazards, and the codes of practice offer concrete guidance on effective controls. Taken together, these laws set standards and also channel many claims through the statutory scheme. Limiting concepts also matter. Obvious risk provisions presume awareness of risks that are apparent, which does not map neatly onto psychiatric harm for employees. There is generally no duty to warn of obvious risks, and inherent risk provisions remove liability, where harm could not have been avoided even with reasonable care, although a duty to warn can still arise. Voluntary assumption of risk requires informed and genuine acceptance, which is uncommon in an employment relationship and sits within the limits identified in Roots v. Shelton. Contributory negligence can reduce damages if a worker's own care fell before what was reasonable, but it tends to play a modest role in psychiatric injury. Sections 13 to 16 and sections 23 to 24 of the Civil Liability Act contain the key provisions. In practice, the framework still reflects a single event mindset. Cumulative exposure, which is the everyday reality in social work, remains harder to recognize and to prove. That under-recognition can be traced to how TAME and ANETs have been applied in practice. Filters in the workers' compensation scheme, especially sections 32, and the gap between negligence standards and work, health and safety duties mean the negligence system does not always drive prevention. The result is a mismatch between what the evidence shows about psychosocial risk and what the law deters or compensates. The United Kingdom offers a useful reference point. For primary victims, once personal injury is foreseeable, there is no separate requirement that psychiatric injury be independently foreseeable. That principle is set out in Page v. Smith. In workplace stress cases, decisions such as Hatton v. Sutherland and Barber v. Somerset County Council look at what the employer knew or should have known from warning signs like sickness, absence, and complaints. When the risk is evident, employers are expected to adjust workloads, provide support, and monitor outcomes. That approach gives a clearer pathway for cumulative exposure and supports explicit recognition in Queensland. The first reform is to clarify in the Civil Liability Act that repeated or ongoing exposure to traumatic material can satisfy foreseeability and the threshold of a risk that is not insignificant in employment settings. When a court assesses breach, it should be able to consider recognized psychosocial controls as part of what is reasonable in this sector, including safe caseload ranges, regular supervision and structured debriefing, training about vicarious trauma, systematic psychosocial risk assessments, and timely access to the Employee Assistance Program. This aligns the standard of care with practices that competent employers already use, which fits comfortably with Section 9. The second reform is to align breach analysis with the primary duty under Section 19 of the Work Health and Safety Act. Codes of practice should be persuasive evidence of reasonableness. Where employers omit basic controls identified in these codes, that omission should weigh towards breach. At the same time, the settings in the workers' compensation scheme should be coordinated so that exclusions for reasonable management action do not undermine the duty to manage psychosocial hazards. The third reform is to provide guidance on evidence and causation for multi-factor psychiatric harm. Courts should be able to find factual causation where a breach made a material contribution to the injury after a common sense evaluation under Section 11. That approach is consistent with March v. Strama. In cases involving warnings or employer knowledge, the law should recognize the link where a breach increased risk or removed a meaningful opportunity to avoid or reduce exposure, which is the logic illustrated in Chappell v. Hart. The rule in Tibet v. Get against recovery for a bare loss of chance would remain. The practical guidance would point courts and workplaces to contemporaneous complaints, workload data, supervision records, referrals, and clinical opinion. A system adjustment can also help. Workers' compensation can be strengthened for psychological injury, for example, through clearer coverage of cumulative exposure or presumptions for defined high-risk roles, while negligence remains available for serious failures and for genuine top-up loss. The scheme should be coordinated to avoid double recovery. This preserves speed and certainty and retains a deterrent signals when employers ignore known controls. The policy aims identified in the review of the law of negligence support coherence and affordability, and experience in New Zealand's accident compensation scheme shows the value of swift access to care, even though Queensland would keep fault for serious failures. To close, psychiatric injury in social work is foreseeable and preventable when it is managed well. Yet the negligence framework has not fully kept pace. Clarifying foreseeability for cumulative trauma, aligning breach with work health and safety duties, providing practical guidance on causation, and strengthening compensation settings would better balance the interests of workers, employers, and the community. The authorities I've mentioned, including Tame and Annetts, Kohler, Kazarov, March v. Strama, Medellin, and Tibet, all point towards the same direction. Cumulative risk can be known and managed, and the law should reflect that reality. For the Queensland Social Workers Association, that means advocating for target legislative change, promoting consistent practice standards, and gathering strong data on workload and injury so that reform remains evidence-based. Thank you. I would like to leave you on one last point, however. Queensland relies on social workers, and the law should too. Let's align negligence with what we already know about psychosocial risk so our members can do their work and do it too.